Hi, I'm Jamie, and welcome to the CDNify podcast. Today I'm joined by Ben, our front-end developer, and we're going to be chatting with Paul Lewis. For anyone that doesn't know, Paul works for Google on the Chrome Developer Relations team, helping developers improve the performance of their sites and apps. He also runs a site called Aero, which focuses on why web performance matters and gives guidance on what we should be doing in order to improve. Today we're going to be chatting about web performance, user experience, and front-end best practices. So, Paul, do you mind telling everyone a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Well, I think you guys have done a very good job of introducing me there. As you said, I work on the developer relations team at Google, and I think my focus has been, it's a pretty big mission really, is to try and get the web to 60 frames a second and try and help developers. It's a kind of two-way street really. One is working with our engineering team to kind of, in any way, share what developers need and how they're finding working with Chrome and so forth. And then on the other side saying, okay, developers, here's what you really need to do, here's what's new in the platform, and here's how we can all try and get ourselves to 60 frames a second. The ultimate reason for that is, it matters to the people who use the sites. If you hit something that runs slowly, it's annoying. Yep. And it ultimately affects your business's bottom line if your stuff doesn't run well. So that's really why it's not just a kind of a vanity thing for me, in terms of going, the web runs at 60 frames a second, pat on the back, everybody, let's go home. It's very much along the lines of how do we actually, improve the platform, because ultimately that is a sort of business mechanism, and it's just a good thing for people in general to be able to have fast running stuff. So that's me and my big mission.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the browser is extremely fast and can render content within milliseconds, but it can often be slowed down when rendering large sites or web applications which have a lot of animation. So how much impact can be made by optimizing things like CSS selectors and JavaScript and things like this?
So my immediate reaction is to say no, and and that's because optimizing CSS selectors, it has its place, but sometimes it's a bit like switching a cake for a muffin.
Yeah.
If weight loss is your goal, then you've chosen the wrong thing.
Yep.
And so the best way to look at this is actually looking at degrees of damage almost to the DOM and to the kind of the runtime overall, particularly. Because it's worth kind of saying first and foremost, there's a sort of split when it comes to performance. Part of it's down to page load, which is obviously almost had a lot of attention over the last 10 years or so. And then there's the area that I've been more focused on in the past year and a half, which is runtime.
Yep.
And so I guess that's the thing we're really talking about here. So there are a bunch of steps that the browser is going to go through to actually get content on the screen, like figuring out what styles apply to the elements, which is obviously what you're saying with the CS selectors. Yeah. But there's actually then the calculation of the geometry, like layout, okay, and then painting and then compositing all the elements onto screen. And it's actually in those areas that you're going to apply a foot gun and blow off your feet, because figuring out what styles apply to which elements can be expensive, but it's more likely that it's because the DOM is big, or you've changed the width of an element or something that's knocked out all the other elements.
Yeah.
Those are much more likely to hit your frames per second and your responsiveness than, hey, this div has this particular style applied. So I think it's probably generally focusing on the wrong things to say that.
Okay.
Yeah, so following best practices is a must then, if you want to get the most out of your code. Can you recommend some rule of thumb practices that can help developers produce modular, responsive, and overall lightweight code?
Oh, a nice small sort of guide there. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few things that I always try and say. One, avoid writing code, if at all possible.
Oh, agreed, absolutely.
The best code, the most stable code is the code you don't write. Yeah. And so if you can, for example, animations that are handled by CSS animations and transitions can, not always, but can often be better than writing loads of JavaScript, for example. That's a good thing. But generally, I would say, the way I look at it is actually a game of constraints, which is that you've got about 4 or 5 constraints for most browsers, or most devices, I should say. Sorry, network, screen, GPU, and CPU, and you need to just kind of assume that every single one of them is off. And then what do you do in that situation? So, for example, if the GPU is really weak, don't do stuff that puts the GPU under strain. If the network is poor, try and figure out a way to avoid making the requests. It's that kind of mentality that's actually the best, because you will by nature start to ship the kind of the smallest, most compact form of what it is you're trying to do, and then you can scale it from there. So it is progressive enhancement, I suppose. More practically, if you're doing things like animations, avoid anything that triggers layout, so changing widths, heights, paddings, margins, anything that would affect the geometry of the page. Avoid that if at all possible. Avoid overly large changes to the DOM. So you might find, for example, some people are a big fan of changing a class on the body for the state of their apps, and that's totally understandable. But the problem is you essentially invalidate the entire render tree when you do this, because you're saying, well, I've applied something to the body, and everything inside the body may be affected. And to be fair, Chrome is actually very good at figuring out that you didn't mean to affect certain elements and so forth. But it's potentially an overreaching change when actually what you meant to do was change 2 or 3 elements much further down the tree. Yeah. So oftentimes you're actually better just to dive in, change those 2 or 3 elements, and smile a happy smile, and just keep the damage to a minimum is really what you're aiming for.
Well, I think the thing with that is that a lot of the times where you're adding a class to the body is that you're trying to keep sort of a persistence in the DOM, when that should really be handled by, like a MV Star style framework like Backbone or Ember or something like that that's has it in memory rather than in the DOM itself.
Yeah, I think it's not that interacting. So there's a common misconception that interacting with the DOM is slow. It's not that it's slow. It's the knock-on, the consequences of those changes that you're triggering a load of work that is completely unnecessary. Is if you say, you could have kept it in JavaScript, you could have done something else that didn't affect the DOM. Really didn't have side effects, basically.
Yep.
Cool. Mm-hmm.
So, identifying problems within a website is the first step to fixing them. Can you recommend any web analytics tools or services to identify and fix these issues?
Yes, I can. It's good, otherwise this would have been a very short question. Three of them actually spring to mind that I use daily, when I'm in kind of performance mode. Page speed insights is kind of like the starter for 10. And it's basically a checklist for your site. So you shove in your URL, and it will tell you whether you made mistakes, like you forgot to turn on gzip, not minified, unconcatenated your JavaScript and CSS. So it's a really good kind of first port of call. It also has a division between mobile and desktop, so it counts for things differently in those contexts. And there's a new beta UX feature that's just been added, which will tell you about things like touch targets and trying to think now, font legibility, which you wouldn't typically class as a performance concern. I would argue slightly differently. I'd say there is an element of kind of human performance, which is how quickly somebody can get a task done. And if you're forcing them to zoom in, or you're bringing up the prompt that says, what did you actually mean to tap on? You're actually
absolutely.
getting in the way. Yeah, you're getting in the way of the user, right? So it's actually a super useful little tool, and it's the first port of call. If you're starting to get good scores on there, I switch over to web page test, and that's super useful for kind of figuring out, in real world, how am I actually doing, in terms of, does my site run well from another location in the world that's not just me loading it locally on my computer, and that's really good. And you can run, multiple runs from different locations with different browsers, get the waterfalls back, It's super good. And then last but not least, when it comes to the runtime stuff, I spend a lot of time in DevTools, and I guess there's loads of documentation out there now on my site, on html5rocks.com, and on the DevTools docs about how you can actually use those tools to figure out where you're going wrong. Most of the time, you'll actually spend looking at things like the DevTools timeline, where it assumes you want a frames per second kind of view on your data, and it will show you very quickly that you didn't hit 60 frames a second, and then you can start diving into why.
Yeah. Chrome now has a FPS counter in it, doesn't it?
It does. It's actually got about 3 or 4 different tools. There's an FPS counter, which is great, although I was saying to the guys that I work with a bit earlier that my worry over the FPS thing sometimes is that it's like saying, and I'm going to come back to my earlier point of saying, it's like saying you're overweight.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you that you need to do more exercise or you need to eat less, which you could probably figure out by saying, well, you're overweight, but it's not as fine-grained as you think. Because if I say, well, you've got a frame rate of 30 instead of 60, what now? It doesn't take you to that next step of saying, well, why do I have a frame rate of 30 rather than 60? Where is this workload coming from?
Yeah.
So it can be useful in a kind of in a macro sense of saying, okay, I should be getting 60, I'm not getting 60. But you need more fine-grained tools to figure out why that is. And so we've got show paint rectangles, which is great for, hey, did I paint an overly large area, or did I paint when I wasn't expecting to do so? There's continuous page repainting, which puts Chrome into this strange mode where it kind of forgets what it painted. So it paints the page every frame, and you start to get a sense of, is something really expensive to paint? So if it's like, first of all, did I even paint? And if the answer is yes, was it expensive to paint? But for the kind of overview of all the various tasks, not just paint and not just FPS, there is the timeline, which will do network, and it'll do scripts, and it will do layout, styles, painting, and compositing. All in one happy home for you to just suck up and enjoy.
Okay, so we've actually seen a steady rise in web performance, over the last decade, and which that's given us a richer and better user experience. In the next few years, what do you think we will see in terms of performance, and how do you think it will affect the end users?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think web components are going to be a big deal here, because they're a new form of primitive, really, and the idea is, in many ways, if you can have web components be built and standardized in some way, even if that's just de facto in the way that we have something like jQuery, and just a lot of developers are using this thing. Hopefully it gives some kind of reference point for browser vendors and other developers to kind of say, okay, this runs well, or we can make this run well, and it becomes a new base thing. So if I built a web component for an infinite scrolling list, I get that to a point where it runs well, hopefully that means that other developers might use it, and it might actually just generally raise the quality level of the platform. That's, I hope, the general idea, at least from a performance point of view. What that means for end users, well, it's the same end goal as just generally improving performance. I think it's just good for people to have better experiences and faster experiences. Fast is good. But I think what it does is it accelerates that process, hopefully by avoiding... Oh, you're going to get me onto a rant if I'm not careful. Avoiding the reinvention of the wheel. Okay, I'm going to have a little mini rant here. One of the guys I work with is Adi Osmani, and I love Adi to bits because he's got his finger on the pulse for things like MVC frameworks, particularly, and the tooling scene. And he runs To Do MVC. Yeah. And I had a look at To Do MVC one day when I was feeling a little bit cranky and in this mood, and I did a quick count, and I said to him, Adi, why are there 50 MVC frameworks? And he went, well, that's just the ones that developers like to use. And he said, well, what you should know is that there are a lot more that, don't get added to that project. But you said we get so many submissions for new MVC frameworks, and at that point, I wanted to throw my head against the wall. I was like, why, as an industry, are we reinventing MVC on every project? It's like it's got to this bizarre point, I think, where you look at something like GitHub for MVC frameworks, and you're like, there's so many, I don't know which to choose. I know I should make my own, and then I'll put that to GitHub.
Yeah.
And part of me just wants to say, like, throw my hands up and go, stop. And I think web components hopefully will help with this. Instead of 100 implementations ranging from not very good to great, hopefully we can start to converge on some good components, as an industry that actually allow us to solve better problems rather than saying, hey, let's start from zero again and build up our own framework. Hey, let's start from zero again and build up our own framework, which I just don't think it doesn't make sense. When you look at any other platform that's ever shipped, it just doesn't make sense to have no primitives that are sort of that level of power and so forth.
Although I think reinventing the wheel is still going to happen. If you look at things like underscore, and then John David Dalton did Lodash, which is pretty much underscore but better, but it uses the same API. So you're always going to have people that do that sort of thing, aren't you? You
are, and I don't mean to, with my little rant, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't try and improve things or come up, try and evolve and improve things. That's definitely the makeup of the web. Where I just get a little bit unstuck is where you get into this kind of plethora of frameworks that are near as making a difference, doing the same things. It doesn't actually solve a new problem. But I appreciate, it's a balancing act. It's a judgment call for all of us, but I think we are, if I might be blunt, I think we're a little bit too obsessed with making something new and shiny and pushing it to GitHub when we sometimes should just be a little more grown up and go, actually, I could contribute to something that already exists, or just make do with something that already exists, and that is not actually a reflection on my prowess as a developer.
Absolutely. I mean, I've kind of come to the realization that you really should look for tools that already exist, and then if they don't have a feature you want, you just fork it and then add that feature, and then either you pull request that, or if the developer doesn't respond to you have your own fork, and you push people to use that because it has a feature that you like or something. You shouldn't just start from the ground up, I don't think.
Yeah.
It's always good to.
Well, I mean, it avoids just hundreds and hundreds of clones of the same thing, really. Like you're just saying then about hundreds of MVCs, and you're like, which one do I choose?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Someone should make a list comparing all of these things and just saying, right, well, this one does something better, and then
I'm sure there is somewhere. There must be.
Yeah, there was that comic on XKCD a while ago that was saying all of something like 15 different frameworks for doing something, and all these frameworks don't do it the best way. So now, a few months later, there's now 16, because someone's gone and made one.
I can actually tell you it's XKCD 927, and it's how standards proliferate.
That's the one.
Yes. Situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14 ridiculous. We need to make another one. And there you go. There are now 15.
Yeah.
So, 927. You're welcome.
Great. Thanks. Node.js has been becoming increasingly relevant to how we do most of our front-end tooling, using build systems such as Grunt. Going forward, do you think more developers will take advantage of using modules such as Browserify to reuse their code on the server and the client? Or do you think that you're going to see more sort of things like Backbone or Ember being used?
So that's an interesting one. I think I can't see server-side and client-side merging anytime soon. That's my hunch, because I come from a background where I did server-side development, and Java is still, it depends on where you are, but in kind of enterprise, Java is still king. PHP is still, you buy a sort of $4 hosting package, PHP is the one you're going to get. It's only when you start getting into VPSs and your own sort of personal preferences that you start finding, hey, I can run Node on this thing.
Yeah.
But even if you do that, there are the people who write Java, and even if they run something like Python, they don't necessarily want JavaScript running on their server. That's the reality, I think. For right or wrong, I'm not actually saying it's right or wrong because I don't do server side anymore. So who am I to actually say how they should feel? But as I say, there's the server side sort of industry, I suppose, it's a lot more mature in a lot of ways because it's got about sort of 4 or 5 competing languages with a lot of frameworks that are very mature and have been used to deliver huge sites. And I think that my reading of JavaScript particularly is it's about 4 or 5 years behind some of those curves. And I think we do have some fantastic tools that are coming in. I do think Grunt is really interesting. I'm actually a slow adopter, and I really only started playing with Grunt a few weeks back. And that's quite simply because the moment I turn around, there are another 3 build systems. And I think it's Phil Hawksworth who works at RGA. I think he noted that they all sound like bodily functions, like gulp, grunt.
Have you heard of broccoli? That's a new one.
Well, that ruins my nomenclature problem. No, I haven't. I can feel my depression setting in. Build systems are the new MVC frameworks. Really, tell me about broccoli.
Well, broccoli is sort of in a early beta stage. It's created by Joe Liss, and I think it uses the file system as sort of like a cache, so that one of the main sticking points about these build tools is that as you add more scripts and styles through SAS imports and stuff, sort of your build time goes up and up and up and up and up, and it's something that I see like when I'm working on things, and I add a new import in my SAS file, and it just it takes longer for my watch task to run. So Broccoli aims to change that by caching the files that it outputs, basically. So you've always got like a state where your file was at, because Broccoli knows how to regenerate. Basically, it works as trees, right? So you pass it a file system tree, and then you have these plugins that transform the tree. It's really quite interesting. It doesn't work on Windows yet, but it is something to be aware of, I think.
It's an interesting shift, actually, that I've noticed, that a lot of tools they first ship for Mac now.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first started web development, it was Windows and IE4, IE5, and 5.5, and then 6, and it was just everything works with Windows and IE, and that was your whole stack. And then there were these bizarre people off in Linux land with their Netscapey thing.
Linux land.
Yeah. Oh, I never made my peace with it. I did most of my degree on Linux, and every day it was a troll. To be honest, because they were like, use Red Hat. I was like, I really don't want to. But now, it's like, yeah, it's just everything seems to ship for Mac first, and then it's a slightly bizarre situation. I mean, I can understand why. I mean, we all have access to a terminal and so on, and it is a big change that we've seen, and it was almost unthinkable. It's sort of me being philosophical, but it's almost unthinkable back when I started that anything but this kind of Microsoft stack would be normal. And now look at us, Macs are normal, and I guess to some degree we also think, will that ever change? Will we always just be on Macs? And it just shows how you can't in some ways really predict what's coming around the corner. I say that having given you predictions on what I think is going to come around the corner, but I find that interesting anyway. I could talk hours on it.
It's all up in the air, isn't it? I mean, now we have npm, and people are just going crazy over JavaScript modules. I think Substack tweeted out that there was 46 authors on npm that have over 100 modules, which is crazy to me, but it's really good that the ecosystem is it's huge, really.
Here's a question for you then. I'll spin this back on you.
Yeah.
If you're a developer who's not spending all their time with npm or doesn't know who the showbiz people are in that arena, how do you differentiate between npm modules as to this is good and this is worthwhile and this is actually not that good, this is just a clone and not the real deal?
That's really difficult, actually. I mean, I guess it depends, really. I mean, if you're a developer, you're going to understand. You can read code, right? So you can just look at the code on GitHub or whatever, and just the best Node modules are the ones that do one thing. Right, so you have a module that would say take a string and then print it in reverse, and that's all it would do. But that would be a perfect Node module, because that's that would be all it does. Bad Node modules are things that do a lot of things, and I think that's why Gulp is good, because Gulp is essentially 4 Node modules that are all sort of glued together, and then they have a consistent API, right? So you've got, it's just a wrapper around Node streams, and then you've got Orchestrator, which does the task system. So if you wanted to use the task system in Gulp, you just go npm install Orchestrator, and then you can write your own build system that didn't use any of Gulp's streaming stuff. You could just use Orchestrator for the the task part of it, gulp.task.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because it's very much the Unix kind of mentality, which is you have these little sort of units of functionality, and they pipe in and they pipe out, and it's text in, text out, and you plug them together whichever way makes sense to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so that, I think, is described as one of the most simple but powerful things that Unix kind of ever gave computing. And I do agree with that. And I think it is interesting. But I still think that problem does remain, even with Gulp to some degree, is that, unless you're very au fait or you've picked your favorite modules, you've got to spend either a fair amount of time looking through all the various modules that can do that task, or you have to take somebody else's advice that you trust that this is the thing that you should be using. But it feels like there's definitely a gap for saying, actually this is good, this is less good. And I know that's what the Yeoman community has been doing certainly around Grunt anyway, is to try and have an opinionated set of, here are the tasks that you really should be piping together to do this thing, and so I can understand why that's actually useful. Obviously, they have it from a scaffolding point of view rather than just a more general point of view. But I think it's definitely a gap in my mind for any package manager to basically say, these are better, not just because they're installed and they were done by somebody famous, but because they actually solve a particular problem. Like you say, they've got a single concern, and that's what they solve well. Anyway, we got off the topic of performance. I shoved you sideways into a more general developer problem. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's fine. I love talking about this stuff. I think as well, just going back to that point, is that Gulp, they're working on getting acceptance tests for plugins. So basically, they will blacklist any plugin that isn't unit tested, or uses event stream instead of map stream, these kind of things, and they will actually run all the plugins in the ecosystem through this acceptance test. So I think we're starting to see people that are taking care to improve the software in the community by doing things like acceptance tests and, trying to, forking modules and updating them and all this. So, it's really exciting times, I think.
Right, and one final last question. This one might be extremely difficult to answer. Is it GIF or GIF?
Oh, you went there on me.
I did.
Oh, they're not. They are, as I always say, they are not giraffics. It's the graphics interchange format. And I know people go, "What about giraffe?" And the creator of the GIF said it was a GIF. Well, he's wrong. I mean, I ultimately no. I can't bring myself. It's
And on that note, I think that's it. Unless you have any more questions, Ben.
No, that's it. It's been really good to talk to you, Paul. Thanks for taking the time out.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to us, Paul.
No problem. You've left me on a really depressing note. Thanks, Jeff.
Right, thanks.